Welcome back to part two of this lecture. We were talking about the geography and early culture of the Greek people. Specifically, we had talked about the geography, the fact that they had a lot of islands and access to a lot of water, and then we had looked at some of the early culture that was influenced by the Minoan people and the Phoenicians. So we're going to continue on with that theme right now. So, the third group that influences the Greeks is the Mycenaeans. And what you can see here in red, this outline, represents the land that was controlled by the Mycenaeans. But mostly their power is going to be based right here in the city of Mycenae. Now, having watched Greece, Engineering, and Empire, you actually saw Peter Weller talk a little bit about this city. I'm going to share an image with you here in a moment that should look somewhat familiar to you from that video. And there it is. You saw this was the entrance to the citadel in Mycenae, and this image was what we think really the first of its kind in history, this kind of arch with these lions that were carved in here, and there would have been lion heads here that are sort of missing now, but this would have shown that the Mycenaeans stood for power. So let's talk about who they were, and certainly how they influenced the Greeks. A few different things that they gave the Greeks. They influenced Greek religious practice, so they helped shape a little bit of Greek mythology as well. You can see art. Certainly this image here shows a little bit about what they were able to carve and create. Politics and literature. This is very famous because the Mycenaeans, if you know the Trojan Wars, which we are going to study later this week, the Mycenaeans definitely play a role in that story. So they fought the Trojans at Troy in the Trojan Wars. Now I have to understand, before we've even studied this, the Trojan Wars never happened. They're in literature. They're stories. They're written down by Homer in the famous books, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But that's where you'll hear a lot about the Mycenaeans. The leader of the Mycenaeans, a real guy, his name was Agamemnon. You're going to know him quite well by the end of this week. He ruled here at Mycenae, but he's also in the book The Iliad and fights in the Trojan Wars. So he's both real and fictional if you look at it from that regard. Real that he ruled here, but fictional that he actually fought in the Trojan Wars. So again, that'll make more sense later this week when we study the Trojan Wars, specifically looking at the Iliad. The last group is the Dorians. Now, you can see everything in green here is where the Dorians were. And we're not going to use the Dorians as a means of providing culture, because the Dorians really didn't do that. The Dorians were kind of backwards in a way. So let's kind of explain what I mean here. The Dorians took over after the Mycenaeans, but because they didn't really further culture in any way. Not much is really known about them. We do know that this is known as the Dark Ages of Greek history, because the Greeks haven't really developed yet. These are the cultures that precede them, and because the Dorians don't have a lot of information, we don't have a lot of artifacts and things about them, we really kind of see them as culture sort of slowed down. It's when they move out of the area and the Greeks start to develop that we see this explosion of Greek culture. So prior to the Greek culture really coming alive, you can see how that might be seen as a dark age of history, especially of Greek history, if there really isn't any accomplishments and culture coming out of this Dorian period. So they're not really providing anything to the Greeks. However, they are the ones that precede the Greeks in terms of history. If you look at a timeline, the Dorians are there right before the Greek civilization develops. All right, let's talk about Greek culture. We're just going to bring all of this together now. We are going to talk a little bit more about how the geography makes the Greeks who they are, and certainly some of the other ideas coming from the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, and the Minoans will fit into this as well. So due to the warm climate, the Greeks enjoyed and participated in outdoor activities. So there's one way that geography absolutely affected their culture. They definitely were athletic, hence the Olympic Games. And that's not possible if you live in a colder climate. So geography matters right there. Due to the terrain, the Greeks created city-states. If you remember in part one, I had talked about how the terrain really cut off the Greeks politically. Cities were not really connected to one another. Sure, they might have some roads, but you couldn't do a lot of traveling because you'd have to go over these hills and mountains to get there. So these cities stayed sort of separate, and hence the word city-state. We have to know that term in order to understand the Greeks. So our review here is a city-state operated much like an independent country does. I always use the example that if Big Lake, Monticello, Elk River, Buffalo, Anoka, all these cities, if we shared culture, maybe we worshiped the same gods, maybe we had the same language, and even traded with one another, but we operated ourselves, we ruled ourselves, we had our own government, we would be city states. But we're not, because we're all part of Minnesota, we're all part of the United States. But the Greeks, each city was independent of one another, even if they did trade with one another and have some similar culture. And that's because of the terrain, so their geography matters again. So due to the city-states, the Greeks were a civilization, but not an empire. Throughout the Greek civilization, there will never be one ruler who rules all of those city-states. It does not happen. So they are never an empire. They are a civilization. The Greeks shared similarities in culture, but politics and military differed by city. So I've already kind of touched on that, especially when you look at Athens and Sparta. Athens has got a much better navy because they have access to water, whereas Sparta is going to have a much better army because they're landlocked. They do not have access to water. Yeah, they might worship the same gods. And they're actually going to have different governments, but they're still Greek. They're just different Greeks, if that makes sense. Their city-states, their politics, and their military were very, very different, even though they both considered themselves Greek. So, some of the Greek city-states here, we've got Sparta, Argos, Corinth, Megara, and Athens, but in this story, in this unit, we're going to focus on Athens and Sparta. Those really are the two best-known city-states. Continuing on with the culture of the Greeks, Greek epics or narrative poems celebrated heroic deeds and characters. These are stories that are still read about today. You want to talk about an influence of any culture on history? If you're still looking at their stories, if you're still looking at how they live today, they're definitely influential, and we can absolutely say that about the Greeks. And that definitely comes from Homer. Now, certainly it's not Homer Simpson, but Homer was a poet who supposedly wrote the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan Wars that you're going to hear later this week, and the follow-up story called the Odyssey. You're going to know both of those stories pretty well here by the end of this unit. And I think they're both just really timeless stories. They involve love, they involve murder, they involve war, they involve sex. I mean, these are all human emotions that we still go to the movies to look for today. And so Homer, I say supposedly wrote them because there is some debate about that, but Homer is given credit for writing both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we'll look at those further in this unit a little bit later. We talked about Greek shipbuilding. Due to the sea, the Greeks were master shipbuilders. You've heard me mention that already, but if we talk about how geography shapes Greek life, this is a big deal here. And one of the things they built were triremes. You can see this picture of the trireme right here. Definitely a very well-built ship. They were sturdy, and they had this battering ram in the front. Engineering and Empire talked about these in the video that we watched last week. I mean, you could row these things quite fast, and you would plow into an enemy ship, and as soon as you did that, that ship was doomed. I mean, it would sink within a matter of minutes if you hit it properly. And so these triremes could be very, very useful on the open seas. Of course, you could transport things. They could be used for trade. They could be used for just moving your military, but certainly in open battle on the seas, they were very, very good. Greek architecture. You saw this. This is the Parthenon. You saw this in Engineering and Empire as well. You want to talk about influence on today's culture. I mean, where do you see similar structures like this today? I'll give you an opportunity to just kind of pause and think about that. But these columns are world famous. So now that you've had a minute to pause and think about it, some places that come to mind for me are the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., the White House, the Capitol in St. Paul. A lot of those buildings are all built out of marble, just like the Parthenon here was, to mimic the ancient Greeks, because we are a democracy. The Greeks gave us democracy. And of course, that's something I think most of us know pretty well by now, something we will study later on in this unit. But there's no doubt architecture is a big part of the Greek culture. So the Greeks would pioneer democracy, philosophy, warfare, and architecture. We'll look at some of those more deeply in the unit later on, specifically philosophy. We'll talk about what that means, and we'll talk about three thinkers, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, that really pioneered the idea of philosophy for us, ideas that we still use today in the modern world. The Greeks would fight many battles against the superpower at the time, the Persians. And the reason I'm mentioning that here in a lecture about geography and early culture is the Persians are going to be a big thorn in the side of the Greeks. This is foreshadowing for us, because we're going to learn all about who the Persians were, and then we're going to look at the Persian Wars. So I put this in here basically to kind of set the stage for what is to come. We'll definitely look more deeply at the Persians as well. And we will end our unit with Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great would blend Greek, Persian, and Egyptian culture as he conquered much of Southwest Asia. So he's going to take what the Greeks had done, a little bit of what the Persians had done, and even the Egyptians, and he's going to make that into a whole new culture called Hellenism. So again, I'm using that to foreshadow what we're going to look at later on in this unit. All right, we're going to wrap things up here by taking a second look at our constructive response question. The question says, identify ways the geography of Greece helped shape Greek culture. Well, we know that they were master shipbuilders. We know that that was because of their proximity to the Ionian, Aegean, and Mediterranean seas. We know that they were outdoorsy because their climate was very good. We know they had to rely heavily on trade because the peninsula of Greece is very rocky, and there's a lot of mountains there, so there's not a lot of farming that can be done. We're definitely going to talk about later on how the Athenians, because of the connection to water, became very, very good at building up their navy. The Spartans were very, very good on land, so that's a definite connection to geography. When we look at who they are, it's absolutely shaped by the land around them. So those are some good examples that we saw in the notes today. You can rate yourself on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. 4 is I get it, 3 is I'm close, 2 is I need some work, and 1 is I definitely better read over my notes again. But that should give us enough information to answer that question. So we're going to end there. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.